Welcome to Mutually Assured Conversation. I'm here with Samantha Green from GreenerSideOfSam. Samantha, just like anyone who's not familiar with your work, how would you kind of introduce yourself?
Oh gosh. Well, I used to talk a lot about Franz Kafka. I've been kind of taking a hiatus right now because I've been writing a lot. I write poetry and short stories, and I've been working on a novella. So that's almost I'm on draft 3 of that. So it's kind of coming to a close now, and I'm super excited about it. But I really hope to come back to YouTube soon and start talking about books again.
Yeah, yeah. Your stuff you've done on the literary stuff's really good. And
Mm.
for those who don't know, me and Sam did have a previous conversation on Franz Kafka, which I'll link somewhere, which is I think it's a pretty good listen. But I'm biased, of course. So anyway, this has been sort of a long time coming because we've been quite busy with other stuff. But today we're going to talk about Schopenhauer's infamous, I don't know if you call it an essay, but set of aphorisms. It's quite short.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer's On Women, which is sort of a infamously misogynistic, or known as infamously misogynistic, like bit of philosophy. And basically, if anything that Nietzsche ever wrote made you cringe, like this will make you wince. At least the first times you read it. But I think it, instead of just roasting Schopenhauer, I thought it'd be kind of interesting to see what we can actually get out of this. So anyway, you said you had an interesting experience over time with reading this. So kind of without me, um, putting my own thoughts in just yet, kind of what is your thoughts on Schopenhauer's On Women?
Okay, so when I read it the first few times, because I've read it over like 10 times now, when I read it the first few times, I was just furious at him. I'm like, I was so angry because it sounded so much like the MGTOW group
Yeah.
at first glance. And then as I read it more and more, I kind of became a lot more compassionate towards him because he I actually ended up reading the letters that his mother and father wrote to him, and they were very, very demeaning towards him. And I think that he took a lot of his frustration that he had with his mother and seeing how she lived and kind of viewed the world in that way. And so there was a lot of projecting. I feel like had he truly been intimate with a woman, and I use intimate in the context of like he got to know a woman, like everything about this woman.
Right.
Uh
Like
and
basically intimate, like actually emotional intimacy as well. Yeah.
Right, because I feel like, he could have met a woman who was very interested in the things that he was interested in, but, because he spent his time alone in his room with his dogs and his flute.
Yeah.
He didn't really get that chance, and I actually feel like that that might be a lot of I don't wanna make assumptions, but at the same time, it makes me feel like, well, maybe that's what a lot of the MGTOW movement has kind of become, that a
Yeah.
lot of men in that movement have just kind of been isolated from women, so they don't really understand them intimately, because as I read on, I could understand where he was coming from. Because in that society, if you just kind of look at the external, is like, yeah, women have children, women raise children, and that's
Mhm.
just what they do. But that's just kind of what they were allowed to do.
Yeah.
So it was, I felt like there was a lot of assumptions made by him. And had he dove in deeper and actually spoken to a woman, on that intimate level, it would have been very different. And I think he would have ended up being a sweetheart if he had done that.
Right.
Because I don't think it's like his mother said in that letter. She said, "I don't think you're an evil person. I think you're just irritating
Mm,
because you
mm.
can't converse with people." So
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right, and I mean it is anachronistic to say, oh, Schopenhauer. I think it's fair to say Nietzsche as well are kind of the they're sort of proto incels, or maybe even like voluntary celibates, depending on what sort of biographical view you take of what Schopenhauer and Nietzsche did in their lives. But what's interesting is I say that's anachronistic, meaning like, oh, it's a definition that's out of time. It's like when people kind of go back and try and use a modern term like socialist to describe Jesus or something like this, right? It's a bit weird. But what is kind of timeless about that whole discourse is actually, well, there's always been the two sexes, and there's always been that tension between them, which manifests itself in very strange ways. But yeah, me going back through I mean, obviously I've read this many times over many years. I've had different perspectives on life over those years. And, I think the first time I read it, I sort of read it and it was, kind of something it's so overtly misogynistic that it's like laughable. It's like it was kind of a funny thing to read, it was, but I think that's the sort of polemical language on the top. And I think what I got from reading it this time in preparation for this conversation was that he actually makes some very interesting observations about the sociological relationship between men and women. And I think that is not born out of, experience with the positive side of that tension, but it's definitely born out of the, and this does reflect his philosophy as well. Like it's the blank, pessimistic way of viewing the mechanisms of the world, And as someone who's done a very close reading of The World as Will and Idea recently, I did see this on a different level because, The World as Will and Idea does that is his whole philosophy of life. And he explicitly said that was his whole philosophy. If you read those two books, that's it. And this is sort of like a weird amendum to that, basically.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when he uses the word, because you were talking about the sociological, he uses the word to describe women, dissimulation.
Yeah.
And I think he used it, I could be wrong, but I think he used it in the context of you're kind of concealing what you're really thinking.
Yeah.
And it was wrong of me to laugh at that, but I laughed because to us women, I feel that a lot of the men in that particular thinking, they think that the dissimulation is used as a way to be what's the word for it? Be not coy, but like you're trying to do something bad or get a gold digging, like get the man's money.
Oh, the other
kind of thing.
this depends on what translation you've got. I've got like the Penguin Classics one, but the word he uses as in another place is that he describes women as having men use force and women use cunning.
Cunning, yes.
Right.
Okay. I laughed at that part because to women, the reason why cunning is used is not to, or dissimulation is used, is not to break down men or to hurt men, but because it's to survive. There was actually a story about a woman. She was talking about how a man was asking her, well, why do you give out your number to a man if you don't have any intention of going out with him?
Yeah.
And she said, just blankly, she said, because I don't want to be murdered. And especially now that the whole MGTOW movement has been rising, a lot of like if a woman rejects a man, there have been stories where oh goodness, recently a woman was hit in the face with a brick. A woman was run over by a car simply for rejecting a man. And I actually believe this might be making assumptions myself, but I actually think that we'll see more of this as the tensions rise between men and women, because we don't even feel like we can be upfront about it. It's kind of like this kindness versus niceness. And if a woman feels really comfortable with you, she'll be kind and she'll kind of open up to you.
Yeah.
If she doesn't feel comfortable, she'll kind of put that mask of niceness over herself just to protect herself. But a lot of men misinterpret that as flirting. And so that also gets her in trouble. And so it's a very fine line of I I don't like to use the word cunning, but it kind of has to be
Yeah.
to save your life. So and it's fun. It's funny too how he oh gosh, I lost it. It'll come back to me. But he was talking about something else that made me think of that.
Yeah, and actually, as part of this, I don't know if you agree or disagree with me, but I did pick out like certain sections that would be good to read like a part of,
Oh yeah.
to reflect on. And you know, it's interesting that we came to the same part that uses the word dissimulation and cunning, because that's one of the ones I earmarked. So this is from section 5. As the weaker sex, they are driven to rely not on force but on cunning. Hence, their instinctive subtlety and their irascible tendency to tell lies. For, as nature has equipped the lion with claws and teeth, the elephant with tusks, the wild boar with fangs, the bull with horns, and the cuttlefish with ink, so it has equipped women with the power of dissimulation as her means of attack and defense, and has transformed into this gift all the strength it has bestowed on a man in the forms of physical strength. And he adds on there, and the power of reasoning, which is interesting as well, the whole idea that women don't have the power of reason as well. But that seems like an amendum to that. But it's quite interesting because what we've just described, like, it's all this is kind of like part of the feminist critique as well, is that you know, the leering eyes of men which lead to their violence is that's part of the oppression. And it almost, like, you could take the part at the beginning of that where it says as the weaker sex, and the part at the end of that where it says and the power of reasoning, and you could tell me that maybe is like a feminist description of the nature of the sexual relations, and you might almost like believe it, because it is just like a very blank and violent description of the facts of the matter.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting what you were talking about with reasoning. I wrote some notes on that as well, because he will say that women are weaker in their reasoning, and yet he will go on to say that men are so just overtaken by a woman's beauty.
Yeah.
And it makes me think, like, well, wouldn't the reason be weakened then if men are so overtaken by women's beauty?
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
so
we've
which
already
is it?
established that you know, men aren't complex enough to understand the subtleties of when a woman's being nice and when they're flirting. We've already established that. So where's your reason now? You know, like.
Yeah, and oh gosh, and I hate bringing up this guy, but very much like Andrew Tate. I think, and I think this is why he has a lot of followers, is that he says things in a way where if you kind of look at it point blank, it's, you think he's being logical, but he's really not, because he's not diving deeper into the subtleties of what a woman actually is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Where else do they want to go with this? Yeah. So, okay, I just want to see what you think of kind of one of his introductory remarks. So this is in section 2. One needs only to see the way she is built to realize that a woman is not intended for great mental or for great physical labor. She expiates the guilt of life not through activity but through suffering, through the pains of childbirth, caring for the child, and the subjection to the man, to whom she would be a patient and cheering companion.
This section always makes me laugh so hard.
it's got the statement, not built for great mental or great physical labor, but then on the other hand, says that in its very, to say expiates the guilt of life and through suffering, like, I'm sorry, that's like almost Christianic, like it's like to go through the pains of childbirth is like carrying your cross almost.
Right, it's like, "Oh, well," I've heard people say, "Well, women have just had children for thousands of years, so it's fine."
Yeah.
And, I wrote here, my first note was, "These are really contradictory statements," when he says, "We're not meant to undergo great labor," and
Yeah.
we literally go through labor that is almost compared to being burned alive.
Mhm.
That it's that painful. And then he says, whether of the mind or of the body. Um, I put here, do you know how much focus lack of sleep requires? Especially after you have a child,
Mhm.
you're only getting like 2 hours of sleep a night, and you are supposed to uh, keep that human alive.
Mhm.
And so that requires a tremendous amount of focus, and so I don't know if he just thought that women just it just came to us naturally, because I can definitely tell you it doesn't come naturally. Some things do,
Mhm.
and it's really, really hard to explain, but a lot of things don't, and we kind of have to learn along the way,
Yeah.
especially, it's like what came naturally to me was I have to wake up for my newborn. When I have to wake up for the baby. That comes very, very naturally to me.
Mhm.
Um, but it was staying up and trying to function through life where I really had to really up the mental capacity for. Um, you'll hear about a lot of women who have hallucinations just because they're not getting enough sleep, and
Mhm.
yet we still go throughout our life. A lot of us, with both of my children, I had postpartum depression very badly, and I still made it work. And so to say that we are not meant to go through great labor of the mind or body is just, it's just a lie.
Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. And I think, and this is where I'm going to step in and maybe try and defend Schopenhauer, is that I feel like the polemical style here is concealing a admission as well as a conceit. And it's very. It's kind of just true from the kind of tail ends you see of like great achievements and stuff. Is where, okay, yeah, you've got great inventors and great conquerors who are men and that sort of stuff, but that's a very, like, to invent something, and yeah, for it to have like an earthly utility, or to conquer like lots of people, and is like a feat of great strength in a very masculine way. Those are very earthly things.
Mhm.
They're things that are bound to the earth, and I don't think Schopenhauer would disagree with this in terms of his metaphysics, because he does say that the only true metaphysics is the propagation of life, and to live eternally is not to do great earthly things, but is to propagate yourself into the future. And that's the admission, is that women are capable of doing this great thing, whether it's expiating the guilt of life, as you would say polemically. They are capable of doing this great magical thing that is a mystery to men, pretty much, actually.
Mhm.
And that, like you said, there are these things that you very often have to learn on the fly as a woman. It's a completely different ball game. And I think I do agree with Schopenhauer. I say it's tied to metaphysics as well, because, like, what is eschatology and metaphysics but life and death itself?
Mhm. Mhm. And especially with I can agree a little bit where it's like if you build something, it's like you build this great building that is there for years and years and years. It's able to be seen by people. But if you're taking care of children, it's not really seen. It's very much continuous, invisible work.
Yeah.
And so I can understand from that point of view. It's because it isn't seen, and it isn't something that he uses the term where he talks about how women are childish. I think childlike is a better term, because we live in the now, and maybe that's what he's referring to when he's talking about that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly, so that's moving on to like section 3. Women are suited to being the nurses and teachers of our earliest childhood, precisely because they themselves are childish, silly, and short-sighted. In a word, big children, their whole lives long, a kind of intermediate stage between the child and the man, who is the actual human being, man, one who has only to watch a girl playing with a child, singing, dancing, and singing with it in the whole day, and then to ask oneself what, with the best will in the world, a man could do in her place. And that's what I think that's what you're describing is, in a sense, Schopenhauer's right, but only if you view things as a man from the outside in the time period that he's in. And actually, I think that, well, again, he's begging the question here. Ask oneself what, with the best will in the world, a man could do in her place. Well, we want to talk about, like modern men being childish. I mean, there's copious examples, like what, I mean, I wouldn't describe, like you've mentioned Voldemort himself, Andrew Tate, right? Like, I think you
like how you called him
he's like a 13-year-old boy's idea of what a
yes.
man is, you know what I mean? Like
very like violent and
to like just call women pejoratives and think that's like cool, or it's cool to wear sunglasses indoors, is like, that is the most childish thing in the world.
yeah, and it's so funny because you ask women, and most of them are like, oh yeah, he's so childish. And so it's very strange to see like him and other men like him. I call them the podcast bros. Act like
Oh god, I hope I'm not one of those bros.
no.
But
It's like
sorry.
it's like one of those shows where they just intentionally bring women on to just demean them.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like one of those.
Yeah, it's weird. And I mean, I don't know, like just speaking anecdotally, but I know this is an issue in lots of relationships, is that, and he mentions about the stages of life in which, women are so great with children is, the early stage. And I think, a common complaint in relationships is that, well, someone's just a mama's boy and never does anything for themselves, and they just move that sense of care across to their partner. And
yeah,
then it's not a surprise that, you're in a relationship with a big child,
yeah. And that is if there are any men listening, that is not sexy. Don't do it.
Yeah.
But going back to Schopenhauer, the how he uses the word childish, it makes
Mhm.
me think of how women live in the now a lot. Everything's kind of like evolving in the invisible continuously. The reason why I think women are childlike and live in the now is because, especially in that time when you were really your only purpose was really to take care of children, to have children, to take care of children, to be a good wife. You kind of had to live in this state of the now
Yeah.
because children are extremely unpredictable. It is such a hard job that requires you to be on your toes all of the time. And
Yeah.
so you kind of gotta be in that state of, okay, I'm gonna let it unfold. And also, another good reason that I don't think a lot of people think about is women live in the now because if we didn't, if we were always thinking about the past and we were always thinking about the future, I don't think a lot of women would choose to have children, which
Yeah.
is actually what we're seeing now. A
Yeah.
lot of women are saying, going back to the childish men, a lot of women are saying, okay, they're not stepping it up. we're just not gonna be with men at all.
Mhm.
And that's where we're really seeing the violent tendencies rise.
Mm.
And so it kind of makes me uneasy for the future because I completely understand where women are coming from, where they're like, I'm just going to focus on me. I'm going to focus on my career, and I'm just not going to be with a man for the rest of my life. I don't care if I don't have children. And I'm like, I can understand that. But at the same time, if we want to continue life, we have to resolve it at some point. And a lot of women will say, well, I don't want to have to teach a man. I don't want to have to teach my husband. And but at the same time, we expect them to have empathy and all of this emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
But if for years and years the man wasn't allowed to show any emotion at all, and we
Mm.
turn around and we all of a sudden say, you have to do this, you have to show emotion that is not just anger and annoyance, he's like, I don't I don't know how. And I
Mm.
can understand that from the man's point of view. And it's like, how do we, um, how do we as men and women get back to uh, being able to work with each other with a little less tension than we have now? Because there's
Yeah.
always going to be tension, of course, because it's really hard to know what the other is thinking. Um, or how the other feels exactly, but how do we get that bring that little tension back?
Yeah. And I think that's a great admission, is the fact that we have to accept that there will be tension, because, and this is one of the conceits of modern times, especially if you take it to its logical extreme, is to pretend that there is no intrinsic template difference between men and women. And there is, to be honest with you. And to come back to what I was saying about earthly things and metaphysical things, I feel like, yeah, the focusing on the self, whether that's through material means or means of the ego, which would be extensions into career or whatever people are after these days. That is, and then ignoring the metaphysical gift that women have been given is it's an inversion. I would say it's an inversion of it's just an inversion of the way we're built. It's an inversion of life. It's not to say that a woman can't be engaged in earthly things, but the ultimate unique thing about women is that they do have that metaphysical gift.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bit of a tangent, but it is on this question of childishness. Is I think you can give and I was thinking about this when I was reading it. Was that, what if I replace the word childishness with playfulness?
Yeah, I really
It
like that.
takes out
Mm.
it takes out the polemical sting to it. And it makes it sound, and this is exactly what came to my mind, especially when he's talking about the metamorphosis between child and man, and how the woman is, in his way, like saying it's like a not quite perfect point between those two things. But that metamorphosis
Mm.
almost reminds me of Nietzsche's idea of the metamorphosis in Zarathustra, where he sort of talks about the different stages at which a thinker goes through. And actually, for Nietzsche, the zenith of that transformation is the child, is the
Mhm.
playful one, which is
Mhm.
interesting, because it takes you can take the same language that's being used by Schopenhauer here and view it in a completely different way, because um, you know let's imagine that we're never childish. Let's imagine that we're never playful. Well, like you said yourself, we've got rid of all the spontaneity and creativity out of the world.
Mhm. And that's so right about the metamorphosis. I I really think that Schopenhauer's he was on to something, but
Yeah.
it was because he couldn't kind of see the invisible of women that he missed it.
Mm.
And so when we're talking about the invisible, the metaphysical, there's been an assumption about women that after we have children, we just completely change. You'll hear a lot of men talk about their wives that after she had children, she just completely changed.
Mm.
And what actually happens is, and this is just kind of from my point of view, what I've experienced. I can't, because I don't want to speak for all women, but I know for me, this was like absolutely true. What happens is that when you have a child, it's almost like there's a splitting, and you've got the being with the child that is outward and people see.
Yeah.
And then you've got the being without the child, that being is the one that kind of becomes invisible and it's pushed down. So the being without the child was very much seen before the child was born, but when the child is born, that's what becomes the external. The being without the child is still very much there, but because it's invisible, society doesn't really cater to it anymore. And so a woman is constantly doing this like teeter-tottering balancing act with the two beings. And if she's putting so much into her child, then she loses the being without the child.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we see a lot of hysteria. And I don't mean hysteria like women are like screaming at the top of their lungs, but in the sense of they lose themselves and they can become very depressed. And I believe the number is 1 in 4 women have or will get postpartum depression. And I think a lot of that is tied to that constant act of teeter-tottering.
Yeah. And to be frank with you, I mean, this is to return to something that we were talking about. There is actually ultimately, when you really think about this, there's nothing childish about caregiving. Like, it's an extension of the fact that, well, you know, Schopenhauer is looking at this and maybe seeing women's cunning as a playful game that she does to wind men up or something like this. But like you said, there is a matter of life and death which is underneath that. There is a matter of violence which is underneath that, and the same thing goes for, well, okay, you know, you now have this second thing to look after and protect from violence and death. You have to like plan ahead and make sure that you don't go without food and stuff like this, like to preserve the child, for example. And there's like just there's basically nothing childish about that. And it's just sort of like proven by biological fact. Have you ever? This is a bit of a tangent, but it's something that I read about recently and it's blown my mind. Have you ever heard about the Bruce effect and the Vanderberg effect?
I've heard the word Vanderberg, but I can't remember it.
Yeah, so the Bruce effect, and I believe these are both like observed in like primate species, so it's not been observed directly in humans, but they suspect that there's something similar going on. Is that the Bruce effect is when there is a novel adult male, so that is an adult male which is not a relation present in a family group of these primates. It triggers female puberty at a younger age than would otherwise occur. And the Vanderberg effect is that there is a higher rate of miscarriage when there is a novel adult male in the group as well.
Wow.
Which is pretty dark, right?
Yeah, that is really dark. Another thing that happens that I don't think he took into consideration is that I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary. It's called The Gift of Fear. But women have this very intuitive sense that we can sense fear.
Yeah.
And I actually have a really good story that happened recently to me. I was in the grocery store with my girls, and they were both in the cart, and there was a man who came by me, and he said something, and I couldn't exactly hear what he said, but it set off an alarm in me.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is not a good person. And so I turned around to my oldest and I was like, put your seatbelt on in the cart. And she was like, why, Mom? Why? I'm like, put your seatbelt on. And sure enough, he was like following us throughout the store. And I'm like, there's no way I could have really known that. You just know it. And especially when you're 18, I know I tended to be very, very naive and trusting, but as soon as I had children, it turned into a very, like, my intuition was heightened.
Yeah,
It's so hard to explain,
yeah,
but, it makes me think of, how, a lot of guys who are very insecure, like, you'll have really insecure 30-year-olds, and they'll go after 18-year-olds
yeah,
because of that naivety.
yeah. Because that's the age group they can relate to. But yeah, so what you're saying there is really interesting, because I think that despite not hearing like the linguistic elements of what this guy's saying, and maybe this is where we can get back to primates, because primates don't use the same linguistics as we do, but they could probably tell things from tone and body language, right?
Mhm.
And there are evolutionary pressures, like thousands and thousands of years of evolutionary pressures behind you, where your ancestors, for better or worse reasons, were able to escape violence and threats, basically, that lead all the way down to you. And so there is something primeval within you where you can sense the aggression of men, basically. And that's pretty
Yeah.
dark, but it's
It is dark,
true.
but, I also view it as a real positive. Like, when you read through this, it seems very pessimistic, and it is, but really, when you dive into it, there's a lot of positives that women have, and there's a lot of strength that women have that is not seen.
Yeah. And I think this is, I think that reading this back, I really now think, after a deep study of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, that their works are both polemical in a sense that you can change a few words around and get a completely different meaning from it. And
Absolutely.
like, although, Schopenhauer might have been a misogynist, didn't have any like deep, female relationships in his own life, but he clearly has a deep understanding of something here, and he's getting at
Yes.
something. I think that, in the same way you can read Nietzsche's statements about the blonde beast and all the different races of the world and say, oh, he's a racist or whatever. You can get like, oh, he's almost like, you could read this and think that it's mocking people who actually think this stuff literally.
Mhm.
And anyway, so what you did mention is that you felt yourself developing and changing around the age of 18, which is quite interesting. So I want to read a couple of things from sections 4 and 5,
Yeah.
which might give us some extra thoughts. In the girl, nature has had in view what could, in theatrical terms, be called a stage effect. It has provided her with superabundant beauty and charm for a few years at the expense of the whole remainder of her life, so that during these years she may so capture the imagination of a man that he is carried away into undertaking to support her honourably in some form or another for the rest of her life. And then to continue in section 5, the man attains the maturity of his reasoning powers and spiritual faculties hardly before his 28th year, the woman in her 18th.
Mhm.
Now, I think that's interesting, because I
Mhm.
happen to have just turned 28. So there you go.
Well,
I'm at the
I
height of my spiritual and reasoning faculties right now, Samantha. So watch out.
um, I think it's interesting how he is talking about, women having a striking effect when they're younger,
Yeah.
and then as they get older, they lose that. With my husband, it has actually been very much the opposite,
Mhm.
where he's like, when you were 18 and I was 20, like, we were both kids, and, so it was very different. Now that you're almost 30, it's like you're a woman, you've had my children, like, I look at you as more beautiful now than you were then,
Yeah.
and I think that goes back to the getting to know a woman intimately.
Yeah.
I think
I mean, let's see
a
from
lot.
Schopenhauer's perspective, someone who's never had that sort of relationship before. He
Yeah.
sees, attractive adolescent girls and sees the effect they have on men, and is just like, oh, that is the height. That is like the time. That is when they're at the height of their powers. And in contrast, he knows his mother. He probably sees other spinsters and that sort of stuff and thinks that, oh, it's all downhill from there, but he has not experienced, like I said, he has
Right.
earthly observations of this thing, but he hasn't experienced the metaphysical bond that is created in a relationship, particularly one that creates life.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about how the MGTOW men will be like, well, women hit the wall at age 25.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, are they hitting the wall, or are they just not falling for your bullshit anymore? Because it's a very when she's 18, a little more naive, it's easier to get her to believe kind of what you're telling her, because women are a lot about they kind of fall in love with what they hear. And when she's 30, what you tell her is not going to be as convincing anymore, so you kind of got to up your game.
Right. Yeah. Cool. So I did want to move on to section number 6 and get through a bit more of this. So I guess I'll read it first and then I'll say what I think about it anyway. Because fundamentally, women exist solely for the propagation of the race and find in this their entire vocation. They are altogether more involved with the species than with individuals, and in their hearts take the affairs of the species more seriously than do those of the individual. This gives them their entire nature and all their activities a certain levity and in general a direction fundamentally different from those of man, which is why dissension between married couples is so frequent and indeed almost the normal case. So that paragraph really stood out to me because it sounds misogynistic because it's talking about, oh, women are solely for this one purpose, right? And then you have that weird throwaway sentence on the end of it, which is like, okay, once people are married and have children, they just hate each other and it's all about cunning and all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But contained within there, and this is maybe you can, disagree with me on this and see what you think. I know you'll probably tell from the way I've been talking about, the metaphysics of the, procreation. I don't really disagree with him there. I feel like that is, it's the highest duty of the human race is to do that. But interesting, what you can do is you can flip this on its head. You can replace women with man as well. Like maybe man is just fundamentally responsible for the propagation of the race, Maybe that's not such a bad thing. What do you think?
I agree and I disagree. And this is one of the moments where I was like, oh, he's so close. And, okay, so from looking at my life and talking to a lot of other women in my life, I can see the nature of women being, a lot of people say that the nature of women is to nurture children. But I believe that the nature of women is maybe to create. And that is the same for all women. Now, what gets tricky is what we create is different for each woman. So some women are going to be way more inclined to have like 5 kids and be super nurturing, where other women are way more inclined to have no kids or 1 kid and have a full-time career and create a business or create and I don't, when I say career, I don't mean like being a cog in a machine where you're just like working for the man, working a 9 to 5. Because I remember hearing a guy talking, he was saying how he said women aren't meant to work. And I was like, oh, he's almost got it. And then he goes, they're just meant to stay at home. Yeah. And I said, no, I think women are meant to create. But again, what we create is different for each woman.
Yeah. I don't completely disagree with you. I mean, I've made comments to this effect in the past that again is an earthly thing. I think like things like playing the game of the labor market is like literally beneath women. Like they should be focused on their role as metaphysical creators in my opinion. But what do I want to add on to that? That's an important thing to say.
I definitely.
I think that the thing about careers, whether it's men or women, you think like it doesn't matter which sex it is. Ultimately, people don't really have careers; they have jobs. And
I can see,
like you
yeah.
said, being the creator of something, and
Mhm.
that can be owning a business or you know creating something that's useful to the world. I agree that is more like a career. I do think largely it is kind of the capitalistic psyop though to get us to be ego driven and very
Yeah.
happy to be a dutiful member of the machine.
Yeah, that's definitely something to take in consideration too. And I like that you brought up capitalism. I definitely think that more women are inclined to have children
Mm,
and be in that nurturing role. But
yeah,
I know for like people like myself, it's really hard for me to get in that like playful mood where I'm more inclined to like study all day and I would rather be doing that and write and create in that way. And so I guess that's what I mean by creation.
yeah, yeah. I don't disagree with you at all. And there are actually unfortunate consequences of me putting so much metaphysical importance on propagating, um, because some women and some men are just unable to do that biologically for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Um, and but I do think that the creative efforts of both men and women, even if they're not like obliquely biologically playing a part, can be playing
Mhm.
a part. But I do think that a lot of that energy, like we said, it's retarded by stuff like feminism. It's retarded by stuff like capitalism. It's just completely
Mhm.
like I don't know, like the purpose of a woman is to earn a lot of money and go on holidays by herself, is it? I don't
Right.
like it's just direct energy, and it's
Right. And, because I was very much on, the extremes of both sides, where I was like, "Women need to work all the time," and then somehow I got on the other side where I was like, "Women just need to stay at home and have children, and that's just all they need to do." Like, I was like, "Oh, girl gosh, what's her name? The Pearl girl." Have you seen her? I was like, "Pearl."
uh,
And and and
I was
now I
hoping some of the names you mentioned today would never make their way into my space, but unfortunately they're now here. Thank you, Samantha.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Just don't put it in the tags, I guess.
I know who you're talking about. I'm kind of aware. My only contention is I think she ruined the word based for me. Because she used it in a freaking Piers Morgan interview. Like, how much more mainstream and normie do you get? Like,
But but yeah, going back to that, I was at both of those extremes, but both of those extremes bring a lot of suffering and a lot of hurt and hatred, and I found that, being in the middle is really a really good place.
yeah,
For a lot of people, and I think for men too, and I don't wanna speak on the nature of men because I really don't know, but I I think that, men would do better if they were not treated like cogs in a machine as
mm,
well.
yeah, yeah, and that's a interesting thing. Is I think that from my experience, at least, I was always driven before by how much I earn and social status and stuff, and I did
Mhm,
pursue that sort of for many years, thinking that all the good people I met and all the like fruitful relationships I had were a result of that. But then I realized that when I changed my living situation and all those sorts of things, that actually lots of those relationships were just for the sake of themselves. They weren't because of connections you had and that sort of stuff. And I
mhm,
think that's a lesson that most people can take away, is that ultimately falling into those things like capitalism and feminism and manosphere, these things which hijack our feelings, our emotions, and make us think these fictional things about the world around us and the people we know, are like that's a dead end. But
yeah,
to
and,
come back to like metaphysically important things like the propagation of the race, the perfection of the human animal, like those are meaningful things to pursue, in my opinion.
mhm. Yeah, I definitely think, that's why I mentioned earlier, we have to find a way to loosen that tension and come back together. Otherwise, we're just not going to have life.
Mhm. I completely agree with you. And actually, on the topic of tension, I want to move on to section 7, which has something I think I want your perspective as a female on. So, section 7, men are by nature merely indifferent to one another, but women are by nature enemies. And then later on, it goes to say, so that when two women exchange compliments, it sounds much more ludicrous than when two men do so. Now, there's a couple of things from that I kind of want your opinions on. And I do think that ultimately men fight with their fists and women fight with words. And from the women I've known in my life, lots of them have struggled with in-groups and out-groups and cliques and that sort of stuff. And I think that the way women do combat is much more different, and it's much more political, and frankly, it's much more complex than the way men do combat.
Yeah, especially.
And I
I
also
feel
want
like
to know if there's any anecdotes from your teenage years about this sort of stuff.
Oh gosh, I have so many stories. I have a lot of really good girlfriends, but um, I I've always observed that when a man is not in focus, we're fine.
Mm.
When a man is in focus,
Mm.
that's when things just go haywire,
Uh-huh.
because women will just try to outdo each other. And a lot of there's also an assumption that men make about women is that women will dress for men.
Yeah.
And it's not exactly correct. Women will dress for other women
Yeah.
to make sure they are top dog.
Yeah.
And it's more of a subconscious thing. We don't mean to do it. It just happens. And that's just what I have observed as a woman. But
Well, maybe Schopenhauer's right. You know, women are by nature enemies. I don't know. Like, you're in this competition with each other. You've got this subconscious hierarchy in the same way you've got subconscious defense mechanisms against violence and that sort of stuff. Like,
yeah, and on the flip side, though, it's kind of the same with men, where if there's no female, they're just kind of buddy buddy. But if there's a female there to
yeah,
compete for, then they're like, the fists are out.
yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't know. It is very complex. I will say, and a lot of uh, it has a lot to do with status, and that is something I agree with Schopenhauer, because he made a comment about uh, women caring about status. I think back then it was even more so, and now it doesn't seem like it on the surface because we can make our own money and stuff, but but there's still that underlying, like, you want to have the best male.
Mm.
I don't know if that makes sense.
And it's interesting though, because at least this is my outside experience, but maybe you can let me know if it's true or not. It's almost like, oh, it's not the possession of the best male or just male attention in general that drives this. It's to have that male attention. Sorry, yeah, it's to have that male attention almost.
And now, uh, see, a lot of people are still kind of stuck in that a man has to make more than $150,000 to be considered like high status, like that's what women want.
Mhm.
And that's, some women are still like that, but it's more evolved into can this man provide a path for me to can be comfortable and emotionally safe, and that's kind of seen more as status now. I'm seeing with women. It goes back to how women are saying to the childish men, you need to step it up.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about. We're like, the status now is you need to kind of be emotionally aware.
Mm.
You can make all the money in the world, but if you're not emotionally aware, it's like, well, I don't really want that
Mm.
because I have means to making my own money now.
Yeah. Mm.
And so if that kind of explains it a little bit.
I feel like it doesn't really matter how much money you have. Like if you've been prescribed with the ick, there's no real way of getting out. You know.
Yes, absolutely. The ick is a great
See, I'm
word
down
for
with
it
the slang. I know all the slang
because
words.
I've heard stories about women where there will be two guys and one guy will be making $100,000, but because he gives her the ick, she will
Yeah.
go for the guy who makes $40,000, and she's like, "I'll just work alongside you because you're open with me, you make me feel safe," and that's kind of become more of a norm now.
And this is where we get away from the present. It's like, okay, the man who earns more in the present can give me more things, but
Hmm.
are we going to make a future? Is the ick going to get to such a level that I'm going to have to get divorced? Like, and that's not, you know, and it's interesting how, okay, wealth can be measured by that number, but wealth can also be measured by the security of a relationship, the sanctity of a relationship as well. And I feel like
Hmm.
that is also, again, it's coming back to metaphysical things, that projection across time into the future, whether that's in a personal relationship or the propagation of the race. It's cliche and it's cheesy, but that's actually, it's more valuable than money, you know?
Hmm. Now, I will say as a disclaimer, there is still that underlying feeling that the man does need to provide
Mhm.
because, especially if a woman has a child, she becomes
Yeah.
vulnerable.
Hmm.
And I don't want women to like be really mad at me for this, but at the same time, I'm like, when you have a child and you're expected to take care of the child most of the time, and you can't work, you kind of need to have that uh, that cushion to
Yeah.
fall back on.
Yeah, and it's pretty obvious if a man can't properly provide and look after himself, how is he going to be able
Mm.
to look after a partner and a child and all these sorts of things? But I do think that's true, and there is at the end of the day, okay, money's not important, but if you can't afford food, then you're going to be dead, right? It comes back to a
Right,
metaphysical question anyway, like
right.
it is important, and it's one of those things where yeah, it's similar to, I mean, they just look at individuals on this, but basically, we know from at least even just people's self-reported happiness levels that you increase income to a certain point where people
Hmm.
are getting enough that they need to survive, they have enough fulfillment to do social things and all the other things, but like the happiness doesn't increase from there. It actually in some
Hmm.
cases goes down, and it's true. It's like, well, people can do all these experiences and support themselves, but having a Gucci bag isn't going to increase that 10 times, even though it costs about 10 times the
Oh,
basic
I,
existence.
I can definitely attest to that because through
Well,
the
you don't have any
years
Gucci bags.
of well, well, through the years of being married and making a little bit more money each year, it's like we kind of hit a point where we were like, oh, we're comfortable, and
Mhm.
but now we like kind of added more onto our plate, so it was like we were at the same exact place we were before. So
Mhm.
it's kind of like that happiness level. I
Cool.
think I think it was I think somebody said the number now to be really comfortable with a family of four typically is $90,000 in
Yeah.
America. I
Mhm.
could be wrong, but I believe that's what it was.
Yeah. Which is, I don't know, I think it's actually it's a pretty high figure if you look at like the averages of what people earn and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But that is by virtue of the fact that our society and our governments, they don't prioritize like building happy families, building like secure families. That's not a priority.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
definitely not a cultural priority. That's just obvious. Um,
Yeah.
so things could be structured in a different way. Anyway, I don't know. I'm cognizant of time. I did want to get your thoughts on a couple more things. One thing is on the last little section about monogamy. So I'd just like to read you a few bits here and see what you think about
Oh, yes. I forgot about that part.
Important. I don't know. I feel like we'll get to it, but I feel like he's been almost like a little bit of a sweetheart in some of this. But anyway, so because of the unnaturally privileged position enjoyed by women as a consequence of monogamy and marriage laws accompanying it, which regard women as entirely equal to men, which they are in which they are in no respect, prudent and cautious men very often hesitate before making so great a sacrifice as involved in entering into so inequitable a contract. Let me find the next part. Yes. So for the female sex views it as a whole, polygamy is therefore a real benefit. On the other hand, there appears no rational ground why a man whose wife suffers from a chronic illness or has remained unfruitful or has gradually grown too old for him should not take a second. There's a lot in what he says there. I ultimately think that monogamy is a social technology. Like people might review monogamy as a cultural or religious institution, but I feel like at the end of the day, it's a social technology. And what it does, I think what it does, for better or for worse, it restricts the appetites of the more successful men, and basically allows more men access to the data, like the reproduction pool, basically. And what that does, I think it increases cooperation, and basically it just, it correlates with the success of Western societies. An issue that you actually have in societies that have very powerful rulers, such as the Islamic caliphates, is that this is a situation that's happened throughout history, is that there are actual revolutions against those caliphates where it's literally because the caliph was monopolizing sexual access to females himself and his family.
Wow, that's really interesting. I have multiple thoughts on this because I think a lot of people really like monogamy.
Yeah.
And I could see how it's a really, really good way to kind of create order. But I am also seeing a lot of people, I do see some polygamy here and there, but I'm seeing a lot more people kind of venture into the ethical, non-monogamous ways of living. So you're together with your spouse, but you and your spouse just kind of venture out here and there. And so I'm seeing a lot of that. And I actually do think he was trying to be sweet here when he was saying how like if the first wife gets old and sick and can't really take care of anything, that you bring in a second one to help around with things.
Yeah.
And I was like, in that respect, I think he was really being kind to try and solve the problem of that restriction of what you were talking about.
Yeah. And I guess, I don't know what you think about this, but monogamy is hierarchical and it is exclusive. And basically in monogamy, women are made more valuable, I believe. And I think men are made more disposable. And in polygamy, it excludes a lot of the men, but it makes those men at the top more valuable, and it makes the women interchangeable. And I think that it's just because it's such a fundamental building block of society, is the relationship between men and women. It has a profound effect on societies.
Now, I want to know your thoughts on this. Where do you think you see us going in the future, especially with the deconstruction of a lot of religion? Do you think that things will become a lot more polygamous? Or do you think that things will become a lot more open? Or do you think that people will just kind of still stay in that monogamous state?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, it depends on whether you think that the institution of monogamy is a consequence of Western people, or whether you think it's a consequence of the Western, like, Christianic religions, because pagan societies be much more polygamous, and, like I've already mentioned, Islamic societies are much more polygamous in general. I think the one we'd exclude here is probably the Mormons, but apart from that, I think it's pretty. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think from, like you said, like there's a lot of anecdotal stuff. There's a lot of stuff we see culturally about these polycules or whatever you want to call them, and these sorts of things. But I feel like it's a if you look at the fruits of those relationships, they're often not positive, in my opinion. Often, and again, it's one of those things where we've spoken about the place of women as if there is like a universal template to follow, and a place of men as if there is a universal template to follow. But there are there are ends to the bell curve here. There are exceptions to the rule, and that doesn't play their part. And maybe, I don't know, maybe in the future we'll have we'll just morph into something where polygamy is accepted, but monogamy should be just like the social rule. I guess I don't really have a terrible amount of thoughts beyond the fact that I do think polygamous societies are more violent because it restricts sexual access in a blankly competitive and possessive way. In the way I've described, it makes women interchangeable to the people who run a harem, basically. I don't have any other way of describing it than that. But unfortunately, men are excluded from things, they get violent. And I think monogamy is a social technology to keep that violence restricted.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to the how women are just saying, "Nope, we don't want you," and the violence is rising. So that's
And there you go. Unfortunately, that would be the men going their own way thing. I don't think there is any recourse there. But unfortunately, if women don't want to be involved with men, and this is me speaking very badly about my own sex, unfortunately, the result will be a violent one. It will be a repressive one. As much as I think, some fiction today, like The Handmaid's Tale, is a bit goofy in its the extent to which it goes, I think there is a truth underneath that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I again, like we've talked about, like my metaphysics and these sorts of things, I think we should aim at producing it's not against tension between the sexes, but I feel like we should try and have a constructive future, as opposed to one where we pretend like we're not involved with each other as well. Well, I'm sorry, we're the yin and yang of the same thing, unfortunately. So let's try and work out a solution to this.
Right, and I think especially if we got people to talk to each other who aren't so extreme, I think we would be able to loosen that tension as well. Because if you get two extremes on both sides, then it's just going to be like amusement for the other. It's not really going to get anywhere.
I totally agree. I've got one final question for you before we wrap up here. As a woman and as a mother, what would you say to old Arthur Schopenhauer?
I would say that I would love to sit down and talk with you and have you meet my children.
I think he would probably hate that, but okay.
I would be like, we'll bring your dog's treats.
The dogs and the kids might get along really well.
Yeah, there you go. That's how we get our in.
Yeah, exactly.
And we'll slowly break him down with like just kindness and compassion.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, that's really all he was wanting, was a little bit of kindness and compassion. And because he really didn't get that from his mother.
Yeah. And I think that end of the day, that's kind of, again, like I said, we're all the same species. I think that's ultimately what every human wants. And I feel like, he might be like the most disagreeable person I've ever read about, might be the most disagreeable person I've ever read. But I feel like as a human, he's probably got a soft side.
I think so too. I mean, he played the flute. So
thanks, Sam.